Myers Psychology 4AP. 3A focuses on the biological basis of behavior, neural processing, and the endocrine system. The big thing you need to remember is that everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Neural communication. Biological psychologists study the links between biological activity and psychological events. For example, they study things like sleep and dreams, stress and disease, etc. When looking at neurons, we have three main types. We have sensory neurons, which carry messages from the body's tissues and sensory organs inward up to the brain and spinal cord. We also have motor neurons, where the brain and the spinal cord then send instructions out to the body's tissues via the motor neurons. Between the sensory and motor neurons, information is processed in the brain's internal communication system via something called interneurons. When examining the parts of a neuron, we have several areas. The dendrite has bushy fibers which receive information and conduct it towards the cell body. The axon passes the message along to the other neurons or to the muscles or glands. Dendrites are all short and axons are long. Axons away is a way you can remember it, much like anchors away. They convey info out. The myelin sheath insulates the axons of some neurons and helps speed their impulses. Myelin is laid down up to age 25. As it grows, it aids neural efficiency, judgment, and self-control will also grow. MS is a disease where the myelin degenerates, resulting in the slowing of communication to muscles, and with eventual loss of muscle control. Terminal branches form the junctions with other cells, and the cell body is the cell's life support center. This is a diagram of a neuron, and we will go over this in class in great detail, just to make sure you understand the different parts. As you can see here, the speed of a neuron impulse can range from 2 to 200 miles per hour, and it's measured in milliseconds. When we look at how a neuron fires, we talk about something called an action potential. An action potential is a brief electrical charge that travels down its axon. Neurons act like batteries. They generate electricity from chemical events through the exchange of ions. The fluid interior of a resting axon has an excess of negatively charged ions, while the fluid outside has more positively charged ions. So it's positive outside, negative inside. This state is called the resting potential. The axon's surface is selectively permeable because it is selective about what it allows to penetrate the surface. Now, how the neuron fires. When it fires, the first bit or the first part of the axon opens the gates, and positively charged sodium ions flood in through the membrane of the axon. This depolarizes the section of the axon, and this then opens the next section. So it proceeds like dominoes. During a resting pause called the refractory period, the neuron pumps the positively charged sodium ions back outside, so it is prepared to fire again. It sort of resets it. In a myelated neuron, a neuron with a myelin sheath, the action potential speeds up the hopping from one myelin sausage, as they call them, to another. So it just jumps along. The myelin makes it go faster. Most of the signals the neuron receives are excitatory. They're like pushing a neuron's accelerator, but some are actually inhibitory, which is like putting on a brake. If excitatory signals exceed the inhibitory signals, they cross the threshold and the combined signals trigger an action potential. If they don't, no response occurs. This is what we mean by an all or none response. This is a diagram of an action potential, and I'm going to go over this in class. So I know this is confusing. I don't want you to worry about it. Once I explain it to you and diagram it on the board, it will make more sense. Now, how neurons communicate is through synapses, which is the meeting point between neurons. When an action potential reaches the knob-like terminals at the axon's end, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which are like chemical messengers. And this happens within 1/10,000th of a second. These neuron transmitters cross the synaptic gap, the space between two neurons, in this time period, and they bind to a receptor site on the receiving neuron. The receiving neuron then, for an instant, unlocks tiny channels at the receiving site and electrically charged atoms, exciting or inhibiting the receiving neuron's readiness to fire. Then, in a process called reuptake, the sending neuron reabsorbs the neurotransmitters. So this is a diagram of this process. So the sending neuron has an action potential, and then out the knob-like ends of that neuron flow these neurotransmitters which cross the synaptic gap. They bind to receptor sites on the receiving neuron. Tiny gates or channels open on the receiving neuron, and those neurotransmitters then either cause an excitatory or inhibitory response. And then immediately the gates close and the sending neuron reabsorbs in a process called reuptake the neurotransmitters that are left in the synaptic gap. The list of some of the most common neurotransmitters. Some of these neurotransmitters and their functions are listed here. Acetylcholine is important with muscle action, learning, and memory, and this is the neurotransmitter that they believe is connected with Alzheimer's. Dopamine influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. You see different effects of dopamine, levels of dopamine causing symptoms like schizophrenia and Parkinson. Serotonin affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal, and an undersupply is linked to depression. So some of the antidepressant drugs raise the serotonin levels in the brain to deal with this. Norepinephrine helps control alertness and arousal. An undersupply of it can also depress mood. GABA, a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, an undersupply of this one is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. And an oversupply can overstimulate the brain and give you migraines or seizures. Some people with allergic to MSG have problems with MSG that has glutamate in it. Now, how the neurotransmitters influence us and how drugs and chemicals work on neurotransmitters has to do with whether or not the neurotransmitter situation is an agonist or an antagonist. With agonists, the molecules may be similar enough on the neurotransmitter to bind to its receptor and mimics its effects, like morphine. Morphine mimics a neurotransmitter enough that it kind of tricks the nerve. Antagonists bind to receptors but block a neurotransmitter's functioning. An example of this would be Botox because it actually blocks the muscle's ability to be stimulated and to move. Other antagonists are enough like the neurotransmitter to occupy its receptor site and to actually block its effects. So it tricks the neuron in thinking that it is that neurotransmitter, and it actually binds the receptor site so that neurotransmitter, the real one, can't bind. So it's interesting there. Now this diagram shows how agonists and antagonists work, and I will go over this in detail in class. What's interesting to note, though, is that not all substances or drugs can pass the blood-brain barrier, and this protects the brain from pathogens and other harmful substances. Also, it can cause problems in treatment. Like, for example, with Parkinson's disease, which affects dopamine, you can't just give the patient dopamine because they have to actually take a precursor called L-DOPA that will metabolize the dopamine once it reaches the brain. Because the dopamine, if you just take it orally, it doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier. So it's kind of interesting how this process works, and we'll look at it in some detail. Now we're going to look at the nervous system itself. The nervous system is divided into two main parts, the peripheral and the central. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the peripheral nervous system is further divided into autonomic, which controls self-regulated actions of your internal organs and your glands, and the somatic, which controls your voluntary movements. The autonomic system is also divided into sympathetic, which is arousing, and parasympathetic, which is calming. These two systems work together because the central nervous system communicates with the body's sensory receptors, muscles, and glands via the peripheral nervous system. Again, the nervous system is broken down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and then nerves. Now, the peripheral nervous system, as we said, is made up of the somatic nervous system, which enables voluntary control over our skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls our glands and the muscles of our internal organs, influencing functions such as glandular activity. The ANS, as we call it, is the key player for emotions, stress, and health, and it governs the fight or flight response. ANS may be consciously overridden, however. The sympathetic nervous system arouses and expends energy. If you are challenged or alarmed, it will accelerate your heartbeat, for example. It'll raise your blood sugar so you have more energy to fight or flight. When stress decreases, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and conserves energy. This calms you, decreases your heart rate, etc. Some of the ways to remember the nervous system. The CNS is the brain and spinal cord at the center of the body, CNS center. The peripheral nervous system, our fingers and toes lie in the outermost areas from our center, the periphery, our fingers and toes, peripheral. Somatic nervous system, bodies, somas, right? Voluntary actions are done by choice, just like volunteer work. And ANS sounds like automatic. And this is the body's automatic actions like breathing, heartbeat, etc. So autonomic sounds like automatic, somatic, soma, voluntary actions done by choice, volunteer work. Periphery, fingers and toes lie in the outer part of your body, the peripheral area. CNS, central. Now, when we look at the central nervous system, we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, neural networks. And so basically what you need to remember is that the brain's neurons cluster into work groups called neural networks. The neurons that fire together wire together. And so they create short, fast connections. Learning occurs as feedback strengthens those neural networks, those connections. Example, when you learn to play an instrument, the more you practice, the stronger those neural connections become. Spinal cord serves as an information superhighway connecting your peripheral nervous system to the brain. Neural pathways governing our reflexes show how the spinal cord works. So this is a diagram of a simple reflex. So the finger is getting ready to touch the flame, which causes it to yank the hand back, right? The way it works like this. In the interneurons is where the reflexes happen. The interneurons are the cells in the spinal cord that process motor responses quickly to protect the body from harm. Sensory neurons connect to the spinal cord dorsally in the back. Motor neurons connect in the front, so that's important to know. It is possible to lose feeling in the lower portion of the body in the spinal cord in, let's say, an injury, but still be able to move if the cord isn't completely severed. So if you are injured in the back, but the cord isn't completely severed, you could maybe not feel sensation, but you would still have the ability to move because the motor neurons in the front haven't been disconnected. So it's really fascinating. But in a reflex arc, when we deal with a reflex, these systems work together. So the sensory info enters the body through receptor cells. So on that you see the cells at the tips of the finger. That information is then sent to the brain where it's processed and it decides what to do with that information. It then will send instructions through the motor neurons, and then those receive commands, those areas of the body, the muscles receive commands from the brain that tell it to move away from the flame in this case.